Welcome, everyone, to The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old, historian, surfer, and world traveler. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting some of the latest scholarly research in humanities, social sciences, and surf studies. So paddle out with us while we glide through the world of academia. Joining me today as a follow-up to the previous episode is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Rob Koch. As mentioned in our last episode, Rob has his PhD in history from the University of South Florida, and his research focuses primarily on Juan Perón and the global Cold War. Following up on our last episode about Peronismo, fascism, and the global Cold War, Rob and I will be talking about another facet of his research, which is anti-imperialism and counterinsurgencies during the Cold War. I'm super stoked to have you on the show again, Rob. But before we get started, I'd like to thank you, as well as our listeners, for being part of another amazing episode of The Surfing Historian.
Okay, thanks, Jason, again for having me for a repeat performance here. It actually links very much into the previous episode we talked about with bipolarity in the Cold War and trying to find a new option. So the subject today, of course, is counterinsurgency, which is a development largely in the 20th century in response to revolutionary guerrilla warfare that was kind of being pioneered in China under Mao, but not only there. And the idea of counterinsurgency is basically, well, there's an insurgency, so we have to fight it. And here's how we're going to fight it, because this is no longer a conventional war. One of the main theorists of this idea, Roger Trinquier, just called it modern warfare. He said, this is what you can expect to see from now on, guerrilla insurgencies, and here's how you can beat them. But that's kind of when Trinquier said this in the 60s, the early 60s, and by then it had kind of consolidated into something. But counterinsurgency, it developed in fits and starts, inconsistent application, a lot of experimentation, and it was happening in various places in the world. Basically, the leading developers of counterinsurgency in the 20th century were the remaining European colonial powers at the end of the Second World War. And it's not a coincidence, because in many cases, counterinsurgency is just a modification of how they initially took control of their colonies against the local will. And at this point in the Cold War, it was being used to sustain their rule still against the popular will of the locals. So the biggest two were the French and the British. They had the biggest empires at the time after the Second World War. And others, the Dutch were fighting in Indonesia where they had colonized. And the Portuguese will get into a lot of fighting too in the 60s. But right out of the gate, after the Second World War, it was the French and the British doing the bulk of the development of counterinsurgency. And so to understand counterinsurgency, you just need to understand what the insurgency is. It's a long-term clandestine movement to replace the standing order and implement a new system. So revolutionary politics are a part of it, and guerrilla tactics are a part of it. But there's also, espionage and sabotage. It's just as much as you can do in the shadows to make the people lose their support of the standing order and give it to your new promised system. So, for example, Mao's saying we're going to make China better for the people than it is under, with all these European powers and Japan here with all these concessions robbing the nation. So there's the emancipatory promise that kind of gives the inspiration to the people who join these organizations. And eventually they hope to just replace the standing order. And literally often, if they controlled a zone, they would start providing government services to the people in those areas. The idea is it's a battle for popular support in the end, or as they always like to say, a battle for hearts and minds. And counterinsurgency's approach to that is social control and counter-guerrilla tactics. And again, a lot of these methods that I'm about to describe, they came during the colonial occupation of places, and some even have French names. For example, quadrillage is where they split a territory into zones that each military unit is responsible for, so they can kind of track how that the popular support in that area is. It gives the military a clear picture of what they're facing. Regroupment, which is also the forced relocation of especially rural populations into tighter confines that can be more easily monitored. Because again, this is about social control. So if the guerrillas are coming in and they're trying to win popular support, one of the ways they're going to do that is secretly talking to the population. So if you control the population and somebody new comes, that's probably your guerrilla, right? So they're thinking you can keep the ideas out by keeping the people who talk about the ideas out physically. Another aspect that you'll see in almost all counterinsurgency is the hiring of locals to join in paramilitary or just in the military in favor of the outside, the foreign nation that wants to be in charge, and pacts with the local leadership, especially. So you'll hear terms like local facilitators. And another aspect is air power and or troop mobility, just the ability to deliver military force to a specific location rapidly, because that's actually exactly what guerrillas do, right? They do surgical strikes and then they take off. So this is kind of like the reverse of that. So, and there is some of the problems is there wasn't a lot of creative thoughts. Even the leading counterinsurgencies said, well, you can't have a counterinsurgency without an insurgency, but that's not the truth. Some states just become like police states operating on this model, even if there is no insurgency in their country.
You know, I know, and you were probably going in this direction as it is, but I know your research focuses on Argentina and, of course, Latin America more broadly. And so can you talk a bit about the guerrilla movements and counterinsurgencies in that region specifically? And I guess the question is when did it start and what was really the impetus behind it?
Yeah, that's actually is where I was going next. So I'm glad you asked that. So counterinsurgency began being transferred to unpopular regimes looking to stay in power, especially after the Cuban Revolution in Latin America. There had been movements before that, even before the Cold War, such as the Augusto Sandino movement in Nicaragua in the 20s to get the Marines out. But what happened with the Cuban Revolution, this ragtag band of guerrillas goes into the mountains and starts this war that at first glance you'd say, well, obviously they're going to lose because there was only, a handful of people that survived in the initial stages. But the unpopularity of the regime was their actual best weapon, not their numbers in the beginning. So the insurgency tries to sway popular support in Latin America and Cuba. And that's easy because you have a dictatorship. You have closures of democracy. They really didn't try a lot of insurgencies in places that were democratic. It almost always came in a dictatorship situation. Now, the irony is a lot of the time the dictatorship started based on fears that an insurgency was going to take over. So in that sense, they said, oh no, there's this communist threat. If you're talking in Chile or in Argentina, there's this Peronist threat. So we have to implement this state that's really strict. which in the end ends up radicalizing a lot of people, and they end up joining these insurgencies. So clamping down on society wasn't really a great method for unpopular regimes to engage in. And you'll see a lot of unpopular regimes in Latin America during the Cold War, because quite frankly, capitalism wasn't working for most of the population of Latin America, just as it wasn't in Cuba, where a handful of families that were in cahoots with North American business interests were doing well, and those linked to the government might be doing well. But this type of plutocracy that leaves everybody else behind is not going to have popular support, and that's what you see in most of Latin America. And that's, they all developed their systems of rule through different paths, but they had a remarkably similar outcome in that there was usually an elite, an oligarchy, or plutocrats that were running the show and taking 99% of the profits of the nation's wealth, and everybody else was fighting for the scraps. And they weren't allowing democracy to run and make changes. So finally, the people in the region would get to the point and say, well, we have no other way to make our lives better but to pick up a rifle or contribute to this effort in some way. So Latin America, in some sense, was always going to be ripe for these types of insurgency movements. But the irony is that nobody really realized it, even though they recognized that Latin America wanted to do more than be a semi-colonial region. Nobody really connected what was happening in China with the Red Army, creating the communist state, what happened in Indochina and Vietnam with communist guerrillas, Marxist guerrillas, getting a hold of local sentiments for self-determination in a fairer system. Nobody pictured that necessarily coming to Latin America until it happened in Cuba. And then it was all the rage. The United States has the U.S. School of America, which was at the time in Panama. And they used that to train soldiers through Latin America to increase hemispheric bonds. And they completely retooled the format of the School of the Americas and other schools for U.S. troops as well, especially special forces, to a counterinsurgency model that was largely based on the French ideas of counterinsurgency. So you had even French officials coming to the United States to train the Green Berets of the special forces in counterinsurgency at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and Camp McCall, North Carolina, where the special forces trains. And then they would go throughout the region of Latin America and train the local forces in all these methods. But it had already started before that. It's just once the U.S. put its resources behind counterinsurgency, it really flourished in the region. But it had already, French counterinsurgency had actually already made its way there in Argentina before Cuba. So what happened with Cuba kind of increased the popularity in multiple senses, because the French said, look, this works. If you can do these methods, they work. Now, French methods included dirty war. And essentially, Roger Trinquer argued, okay, we know we need popular support, so we will get unconditional popular support. So not winning the hearts and minds so much, but instilling the sense of fear in the population so that they support you. So it was state terrorism, basically. And you have methods of the dirty war, typically included, they would arrest somebody suspected of being an insurgent for whatever reason. Maybe they had a tip. They would quickly torture him to try to get information, or her, to try to get information about his network of the insurgency before, they figured out he was captured and moved. So they would try to torture these people to get the information quick, so then they could send these mobile strike teams that I talked about with the troop mobility to quickly go take out their enemies with the goal of completely annihilating the clandestine organizations. And so you say, okay, well, torture's happened, it's unsavory, but it's happened for a long time. So what makes this different? Well, in the dirty war, instead of detaining the prisoner after he spills the beans, if he does, they would typically kill the person and then hide the body, dispose of the body in a way that the public couldn't find it. And this would help prevent, legal reckonings, but it would also create a sense in society of this looming fear of an uncertain fate if you dared to support the insurgency. So dirty war methods were designed specifically to instill fear as the method of social control. Plus these other methods of grouping them into these confined areas, as I talked about. And you'll see that in the most famous version that we know in the US counterinsurgency history is the Strategic Hamlet Initiative in Vietnam. And so you're wondering, maybe, how did he go from Argentina to Vietnam? And today that might seem hard for some people to accept, but at the time, these issues were very much linked. Cuba and Vietnam were very much linked in that they were struggles against imperial domination from somebody, that the people were fighting against unpopular regimes. And it came to be seen as part of this global anti-imperialist movement. And so the response, mainly from the West, though there were counterinsurgencies in Marxist states too, but mainly from the West, was these brutal counterinsurgencies anywhere they felt there was a threat. And Che Guevara, hero of the Cuban Revolution, would frequently mention Vietnam. And before he departed to his ill-fated mission in Bolivia, he gave a letter to the Tricontinental Congress, which was a meeting from people around the world, government officials, guerrilla movement leaders, national liberation movement leaders, who wanted to end capitalist domination of the world order. And he left a message that said, okay, we have to start a second and third Vietnam. And that's why he went to Bolivia. He thought he could start another Vietnam type situation in the mountains of South America, because guerrillas prefer, terrain that's suitable for guerrilla tactics, such as the mountains.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up, Che Guevara and, some of his efforts in Latin America. Of course, the success of the Cuban Revolution allowed, as you said, it sort of inspired other countries or other groups to attempt to follow suit, which was quickly met with, of course, counterinsurgency movements. But the Cuban Revolution, sort of helped. It was the impetus, if you will, behind the proliferation of guerrilla movements in Latin America. But, you mentioned Che Guevara specifically. And so, he's sort of noted for his, FOCO theory and specifically related to guerrilla warfare. And would you mind, and again, you mentioned he wanted to create, he's quoted saying, second, third, such and such Vietnams. In other words, to sort of spread people out that were trying to quell these different revolutionary movements. But would you mind elaborating a bit more on, what this FOCO theory was in terms of guerrilla movements? And, how does it relate to the global Cold War, or maybe the regional Cold War, and counterinsurgency efforts in Latin America in the 60s? Because it seems like, the FOCO theory, of course, sort of went away with the death of Che in the late 60s. But would you mind elaborating on what the FOCO theory was in terms of inside the sort of the idea of guerrilla movements, and how, because you mentioned earlier as well, Green Berets, which, were involved in Bolivia with tracking down Che. And so how does the FOCO theory and maybe some of these counterinsurgency movements, how are they being carried out in Latin America.
Yeah, and I'm going to take it in the response as a two-sided response, one from the guerrilla side and then one from the military side, the effect that it had on military thinking. So first of all, the FOCO or focus type of idea is an idea based on the success of the Cuban Revolution, of Castro and Guevara's movement, and how they weren't the only movements in Cuba, but how they kind of led the show and falsely got a little too much glory, even though other people really participated. But the idea is that a revolutionary vanguard can go and catalyze a revolutionary will in the people anywhere where the system is not working for them, especially targeted against capitalist systems. And that's exactly what had happened in Cuba. Their small band of guerrillas got bigger and bigger over time as people rejected the standing order and went to, let's see what these emancipatory promises are going to pan out to be, because the regime's brutality is just, it doesn't compete. So the reason that the FOCO actually doesn't work is that it wasn't the only thing in Cuba that was going on. It was a part of a broad-based rejection of the system, multi-class, multi-level. I mean, you had students that were doing certain things, you had businesses that were doing certain things. So it wasn't just this guerrilla movement. It was wide disdain through the population. So in theory, the FOCO kind of encouraged those other movements to a point. And what you see is after that, numerous FOCOs develop in Latin America because people thought, look, it worked in Cuba. There's no democratic options here, so maybe we can make it work here. And it just didn't. The first FOCO I actually know of after Cuba was in Argentina in 1959, and it was by Peronists. And it was about 50 guys who went into the woods. They didn't prepare society, and it was just a disaster. They got wiped out quickly. 2 years later, one of Guevara's lieutenants came to Argentina. 3 years later, came to Argentina to start a FOCO in the mountains near the border of Bolivia before Che eventually went there in 1967. And this also failed rapidly because the state of Argentina was already prepared for this. And why? Because the military saw the FOCO as something that did work, even though it really kind of doesn't work. So this gave them the mindset of, oh man, a small group of 20 people, 12 to 20 people, can end up overthrowing the whole system and turning us into, the next Cuba. So they freaked out. And they had these methods of dirty war to deal with it. And that's pretty much what they did throughout Latin America. In the 60s, you had FOCOs breaking out in Colombia, Venezuela, Chile had small ones, Argentina had them, Uruguay, Brazil. I mean, there was other countries too. Nicaragua, of course, the FSLN formed in 1961, if I'm not mistaken, or 60. So you had a number of insurgencies, and not just in Latin America, but that formed in the 60s based specifically off of this Cuban example in thinking it worked. And the response of all the Latin American governments, which were tied to the United States through various means, especially financial aid and military aid, including counterinsurgency training, they really wanted to get rid of these insurgencies, and they would just, you hear of these right-wing death squads and paramilitary groups, but also the soldiers who were often conscripts were forced to do terrible things. And, there's this whole idea of institutionalization that a lot of people will do things that they normally wouldn't do if they have become institutionalized. And the military, of course, institutionalizes its people as much as possible, so they follow these orders. And you didn't have at this time as many rules about illegal orders. You can disobey illegal orders. So if you didn't do the counterinsurgency deeds as we're instructed, you could find yourself a victim of the counterinsurgency as well, even though you were a soldier. They would kill and disappear the soldiers that weren't compliant as well. So you had a lot of pressure on these people to do these things, not to mention their families at home that were under threat if they disappeared. So you had a lot of people that didn't necessarily want to do these things doing them, but you also had some psychopaths that would kind of lead the show and seem to take a real pleasure in these things. And you see that especially in Argentina, Guatemala, in El Salvador, where just the most brutal counterinsurgencies took place. In Guatemala, killed over 200,000, primarily indigenous people. In Argentina, they killed roughly 30,000 and had international assassins operating on 3 continents, including in DC, Washington, DC, where they blew up a Chilean who wasn't even a leftist. He was a constitutionalist military officer, and they blew him up. And Argentina was also kind of a proxy for US efforts in many cases. We trained their soldiers at the School of the Americas, and then the CIA would fund them. Argentina sent soldiers to Nicaragua. They sent soldiers to that whole Central American region to train death squad methods and dirty war tactics. And a lot of that was to get the remnants of the left-wing guerrillas who had fled Argentina to escape the dirty war there. And then the idea was, well, we have to just kill them or they're going to come back to Argentina and start the whole process over. So it's kind of like a final solution to left-wing ideas.
Yeah, and it's, like you say, it's best to look at it on a regional and even global scale, as you said. And I'm really glad you mentioned you really sort of tapped into some of the nuances of the Cuban Revolution as well, not just attributing its success only to this sort of FOCO model, but Thomas Wickham Crowley in Guerrillas and Revolution in Latin America looks at both Cuba and Nicaragua, among a bunch of other places, but with Cuba and Nicaragua being the only 2 successful sort of post-World War II revolutions, Cuba 59, Nicaragua 79. And, he looks at sort of the similar conditions that were conducive to a successful revolution. And as you say, it wasn't just these, sort of guerrilla movements per se. It was, a cross-class disdain for the leadership. In 58 in Cuba, Eisenhower withdrew aid to Cuba, and in 78, Carter withdrew aid to Somoza and Nicaragua. And so there's so many things that happened all at once that created an environment for the success of those revolutions. And then, as you say, of course, Cuba, as you know, and you mentioned this in your research, it was met, somewhat immediately with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. But I guess I want to kind of go back to what you were saying with the dirty war and some of these counterinsurgencies throughout, particularly South America. And then, of course, later they make their way up into Central America. But would you say, because you keep mentioning the School of the Americas and things like that, would you say these early counterinsurgencies were the precursor to what we now call Operation Condor? And I guess if you don't mind sort of elaborating a bit more on what is Operation Condor and how is that tied to all of this stuff that we're talking about?
And what Operation Condor was basically a networked database in between South American governments where they would keep track of the leftists that they wanted to target, for annihilation. So, for example, if Jason was on the list and he went to Chile and Argentina wanted to get Jason and Chile was like, hey, we've got him, Argentina might give the order to say to the Chileans, okay, can you kill them for us? Or can we send our guys? Usually they had another country do the killing, a third party country. So in this case where Jason, the insurgent, is in Chile, Argentina wouldn't ask the Chileans to do it, and they wouldn't do it themselves. They would ask Uruguay to send their people to go do it. So it kind of created these layers of separation and plausible deniability. Now, this network, as Patrice McSherry's research, amongst others, has shown, this network was digitalized, computerized, and it was provided by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. What was so amazing about this is it wasn't just information sharing, like UK and USA share information all the time on this type of thing. But this was a multilateral international thing that the US was kind of, the CIA guys were watching it all happen. But, you could put in the data and some guy in Chile could look at it and also some guy in Uruguay. So you had basically the security forces from the entire southern part of South America that just put out all points bulletins, APBs, for these people, and then would assassinate them. So it was much broader information sharing. You don't even see that type of information sharing within the security apparatus of the United States. The FBI and the CIA, they compartmentalize because competition and funding. But these guys did it because they were seriously that concerned that this is going to happen. And in the 60s, it was an uncertain period for the capitalist world in particular. There's a book that was written by a former archivist of the KGB who defected, and he brought all these documents with him. And it's actually titled, "The World Was Going Our Way." And the subtitle is something like Soviet Union Efforts to Win Over the Third World. So there was a time where this whole system that we have today almost was completely wiped out forever. And going back to my research on Perón, that's what he was pointing out when he started trying to get leftist radicals to support his return against the regime. He was saying, look, this thing, capitalism, is dying. There's no saving it. So the future is either going to be Marxist or it can be a Christian national socialism, but it has to become more humane than capitalism. Of course, he was wrong. Capitalism in the end won through a great expenditure of capital. It exhausted the Soviet Union, which is ironic because that was the Tricontinental's point, right? Che's second and third Vietnam was try to get Western imperialist capitalism to exhaust itself. And so it just collapses. But in the end, it was the other side that ended up becoming exhausted because they didn't focus on capital and they just didn't have as much, and it did matter.
I actually want to, and I'm glad you brought up Perón again, because I do want to bring you back to Perón himself and the Peronistas. And you were kind of already starting to talk a bit about it, but how did the guerrilla movements, the counterinsurgencies, and of course, all of this housed within the context of the Cold War, how did this impact Perón and the Peronistas? Would you mind elaborating a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Starting shortly after the Cuban Revolution, and he was living in Spain in exile, and he was observing not just what was happening in Argentina, but he was placing that in the regional context and in the global context. And like I mentioned, he thought capitalism was dying, so you had to choose which way the future was going to go. And he started saying all these things about, okay, we need to get to this Christian National Socialism model, but the big thing is that we overthrow imperialism first. And Peronists were very on board with this. And they saw the local regime, a military dictatorship. And when it wasn't a dictatorship, the military dominated the presidents. So it was fake democracy. He saw this regime as similar to all these other regimes throughout the world that were waging counterinsurgencies. And it wasn't just to stop Marxists, it was to stop any change. And Peronism is a great example of this. The dirty war that hits Argentina in the 70s after Perón's death, where the military killed 30,000 people, their number one victims were Los Montoneros, who were nationalists, so not Marxists, left wing Catholic university students primarily. And these kids, they weren't coming out of the traditional workers' movement of Peronism. They were coming from this opinion of we have to end this type of tyranny in the world. And from Perón's perspective outside of Los Angeles, it was easier for him to see this is a whole global network. And all this training that's going on for counterinsurgency is all there to protect capitalism, not from Marxism, but from anything, because they just want to hold on. So, speaking about the global response, counterinsurgency as a global response during the Cold War, as I mentioned, there were two primary branches of counterinsurgency development, and that was the French and the British, who were the biggest colonial empires after the Second World War. So the French really kind of led the way in all this development, and they were the ones exporting their training. So they exported trainers to the United States, as I mentioned, who then exported trainers to the School of the Americas and also to Vietnam. And then the French were training the Portuguese, who ended up fighting the Portuguese colonial wars, mainly in Angola and Mozambique, but also Guinea-Bissau. And they fight, of course, the French fight in Algeria and Indochina. The French also send trainers to France and Argentina and Brazil. So they proliferated, and the US proliferated more of their version. Now, on the UK side, they had problems in Malaysia. They were training Australians who ended up helping in Vietnam in these methods. They had their problems in Africa also, especially in the Mau Mau rebellion of Kenya. And then South Africa joined in the picture as one of the most oppressive of regimes at the time. And it started fighting in Angola, in Rhodesia, helping the white minority rule in Rhodesia. In Angola, after the Portuguese government collapsed, after 14 years of failed counterinsurgency in Angola, the Marxists moved in and took control pretty quickly, the Marxist guerrillas that existed, and South Africa intervened there, bringing counterinsurgency back from another angle. So, in effect, what you have is these hubs of training. And I forgot to mention the Eastern hub in Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, was run by the nationalists who was defeated by Mao. He took his supporters to Taiwan and started their own independent China there. And he built a cadre for counterinsurgency training that then became part of the World Anti-Communist League, which had a branch in most continents, including the Latin American branch, which was home in Mexico. So you have these training hubs: Taiwan, Portugal, Manaus, Brazil, Buenos Aires, Argentina, the School of Americas in Panama, of course, Fort Bragg in the United States. And then they were doing training in various locations in the Eastern Asia related to the war in Vietnam. So they would help train Australians. They were training the local forces. As I said, there's usually that component of locals being asked to fight on the side of the standing order. And, this comes with its benefits, of course. You're dealing with civil wars that are basically a foreign power often is trying to prevent, but in some cases it was just the local dictatorship was just doing it of its own accord because it believed wholeheartedly, just as the Russians did with that title, "The World Was Going Our Way," that this was a real possibility, that the world could flop and that capitalism could lose its dominant position.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really good point with even the title of that book. The momentum seemed, in a sense, to be moving in that direction. And I'm glad you also mentioned the counterinsurgency or the anti-colonial movement in Angola, because Cuba, to bring it back to Cuba and their efforts around the world, they were sending support to Angola, and they found themselves pretty heavily involved in that, for quite some time as well. And so, you, in calling it the global Cold War, I think that's appropriate because I think it's best to view this from a global sort of global perspective, the guerrilla movements, the counterinsurgency, sort of the intelligence webs as it was around the world. It was on a global scale, and there was a sort of a collaboration, particularly among the counterinsurgency groups and efforts. But I guess I just want to thank you for taking the time to really dive into this and explain it a bit more, because it is. I agree with you. I think it's best to look at this from a global perspective, not just specifically zoom in to one country, because it was a global event of sorts. And, so I guess I'm going to give you the last word, but I guess, what are some takeaways from this for the listener and for myself as well? And so with that, I do want to go ahead and give you the last word.
Well, the takeaway, which we haven't really got to, so I'll express it now, is that counterinsurgency does remain an ever-present thing in this world, and it's still used for the same purposes of controlling an area. And it's almost like I mentioned the colonial roots of this. They use some of the same tactics to kind of pacify areas. We still do that. I mean, we've finally admitted that we failed in Afghanistan, but for a long time, we were just there supporting this government. And our goal was to support it long enough that this Taliban thing just goes away. There was no plan. This is just what the goal was. Until imperialism goes away, counterinsurgency is not going to go away. And it's not going to be pretty. They'll dress it up in nice dresses as much as they can to put it in the shop window. But really the idea is you wage it elsewhere and you try to limit society's exposure to it, like the metropole. So the United States population doesn't really understand what's going on in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe they watched a movie, but those movies do not reflect what's going on there. They reflect specific moments at best. They don't consider the bigger picture. And what we have to consider is that's what it's still being used for, to try to shape all these countries into well-behaved participants in the concert of nations under Western dictates.
I hope you enjoyed this episode on guerrilla movements, counterinsurgencies, and the global Cold War with Dr. Koch and I. For next episode, I'll be shifting gears a bit to talk with Tara Ruttenberg and Dr. Pete Brocious about different types of surf localism in the context of surfscape colonialism in the global North and global South. Tara is a PhD candidate in development studies and specializes in critical surf studies and alternatives to development in sustainable surf tourism. Pete's a research professor of anthropology at the University of Georgia and founding director of the University of Georgia's Center for Integrative Conservation Research. This will certainly be an episode you won't want to miss. This has been another episode of The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening. And until next time, stay stoked.